The fall happened on a Tuesday morning in March, which is the kind of morning that Lexington, Kentucky produces in the transition between winter and spring, cold and damp and gray, in a way that makes the inside of a house feel smaller than its dimensions. I was carrying a basket of laundry down the stairs from the second floor to the laundry room, which is a thing I had done 200 times without incident, and on the 201st time my left foot caught the edge of the second-to-last step in a way that I did not anticipate, and I went down. I did not lose consciousness. I want to be clear about that, because it is important to everything that follows. I hit the floor at the base of the stairs, caught myself on my left forearm and my right hip, felt the specific bright pain of impact that tells you something has been stressed but not broken, and lay on the laundry room floor for a minute, assessing the inventory of what had just happened to my body. The hip was sore. The forearm was bruised. My head had not hit anything. My cognition was entirely intact. I lay there for a moment longer than the physical assessment required, and I thought about something. 3 weeks before the fall, I had overheard a phone call. Not an entire conversation, not even half of one. My son Nathan had been on the phone in the kitchen of my house, which I know because I had come in from the back porch and heard his voice through the door before I pushed it open, and I had stopped. Not because I intended to eavesdrop, but because the specific register of his voice was one I had not heard before in 44 years of being his father. He was speaking very quietly and very carefully, in the voice of someone who is managing information rather than sharing it, and the 3 sentences I heard before he heard me push the door open were these. He said, "The house alone is worth close to $800. The retirement accounts are separate but accessible with the right arrangement. The question is how long before it becomes relevant." He heard the door. He said something casual into the phone and ended the call. He turned to me with a warm smile and said he was just catching up with his buddy Davis from work. I had said nothing. I had sat down at the kitchen table. I had had my coffee. And I had spent the following 3 weeks thinking about what the question is. How long before it becomes relevant meant, from the mouth of my 44-year-old son, standing in my kitchen talking about my house and my retirement accounts. I lay on the laundry room floor in the aftermath of my fall, and I made a decision. I was going to go to the hospital because the hip needed an X-ray, and that was the correct medical response. And while I was in the hospital, I was going to be less than I was. I was going to let them see what they were waiting for. I called the ambulance myself from the laundry room floor. I lay on the floor with the scattered laundry around me, and I waited. And when the paramedics arrived and asked me what happened, I told them I had fallen. And when they asked me if I knew what day it was, I looked at the ceiling for a moment longer than necessary and said Thursday. It was Tuesday. It was the first deliberate thing I had ever said to another person that I knew was not true. In 71 years of living, I had not made a practice of deception. But I had spent 3 weeks listening to my son talk about my house in the voice of someone calculating when a clock was going to run out. And I had decided that the most efficient way to understand what I was dealing with was to create the conditions that would allow it to show itself. I did not know, lying on that laundry room floor, what I was about to hear. I did not know that what the next 72 hours would reveal would be the kind of information that you cannot unhear, that settles into the permanent record of a life and stays there regardless of what comes after. I did not know that my son was going to step into a hospital hallway on a Wednesday evening and say something to his wife in what he believed was a private voice that would redefine, in under 30 seconds, everything I had understood about the shape of my family. I did not know any of that yet. I knew that I was 71 years old, that my left hip was sore, that I had 3 weeks of unresolved data about my son's intentions, and that the floor of my laundry room was cold. The ambulance came. I let them help me up. I told them I was confused about what had happened. I let the process carry me. My name is Edmund Graves. I am 71 years old. I live in Lexington, Kentucky. And what my son did not know, when he stepped into that hospital hallway on a Wednesday evening and whispered to his wife about my house and my affairs, was that I had been a licensed civil engineer for 38 years. That I had built my career on the principle that you never make a structural decision without testing the load first. and that the man lying in that hospital bed was not confused about anything. He was collecting data. Welcome to True Story. Hit that subscribe button and drop your city in the comments below. We read every single one. Now let's get into this. I spent 38 years as a structural and civil engineer, the first 12 at a regional firm in Lexington, and the last 26 running my own practice, Graves Engineering and Site Consulting, out of an office on Tates Creek Road that I had opened in 1987, with 2 drafting tables and a reputation I had spent 12 years building, carefully enough to take with me when I left. Structural engineering is a discipline that rewards a specific kind of mind, one that is comfortable with the gap between what a thing appears to be and what it actually is, and that has the patience and the precision to close that gap through systematic testing rather than assumption. A beam looks sufficient or it does not. What matters is not the appearance but the load test. You apply the load. You observe the result. You build your conclusions from what the test shows, rather than from what the visual suggested. I had applied that discipline to 38 years of professional practice, and I had applied it, in ways I had never fully articulated, to the rest of my life as well. I did not make important decisions from incomplete information. I waited, assessed, tested, and decided from what the evidence actually said. My wife Frances had called this my engineering problem and my engineering superpower in the same breath, which is the kind of observation that only someone who has known you for a very long time can make accurately. She said, "Edmund, you are the least impulsive person I have ever known, which is maddening half the time, and the reason I trust you completely the other half." Frances Ann Graves, born Frances Ann Whitaker in Harlan, Kentucky in 1952, was a high school French teacher for 29 years, and the person I organized my life around from the moment I met her at a university mixer in 1974, and she told me, with the directness that was her most consistent quality, that she found engineers interesting because they were the only people at the party who would admit they didn't know something. Frances died of lung cancer in January of 2020. She was 67 years old, diagnosed in the spring of 2019, and she managed the 9 months between diagnosis and death with the same directness she brought to everything. She organized her files. She wrote letters to both children and to her sister in Harlan, and to 3 former students. She revised her garden notebook so the person who tended it after her would understand what she had intended. She told me in October of 2019 that she had spoken with our attorney about the estate and that everything was in order. I said, "Frances, I'm not worried about the estate. I'm worried about what comes after you." She said, "Edmund, what comes after me is your engineering problem. Apply the method." I had held her hand and said nothing further. The method she was referring to had never been designed for this particular load. I learned to apply it anyway. I had 2 children. Claire was 38, lived in Cincinnati, where she worked as a hospital administrator, called me on Tuesday evenings and Sunday mornings with the consistency of someone who had internalized the rhythm of the relationship and maintained it because she wanted to, not because she felt obligated. She had driven down from Cincinnati twice in the months after Frances died without being asked, and had spent those weekends doing the practical things and the sitting with me things in the correct proportion. She had her mother's directness and her mother's understanding of when a person needed action and when they needed presence. Nathan was 44. He lived in Lexington, 12 minutes from my house on Andover Drive. He worked in commercial real estate financing, which gave him a practiced fluency in property values and asset structures that I had noticed him applying to conversations about my situation, with increasing frequency in the 3 years since Frances died. He was warm in the performing way of someone who has understood that warmth is a form of access. He had Frances's smile, which I mention because it is the detail that has always made the harder things about Nathan harder. He brought his wife Sandra and their 2 children to Sunday dinners. He called on birthdays. He arrived for holidays with bourbon and the energy of a man managing a room rather than simply being in it. Sandra was 42, worked in marketing, and had the social fluency that marketing people develop. She was not unkind. She was not warm. She occupied the middle space of someone who is neither, which I had come to understand as the most useful space for a person who is calculating. I had mentioned Nathan's financial questions to Claire once, in the fall of 2022, carefully and without accusation, framing them as something I had noticed and wanted another perspective on. Claire had been quiet for a moment, and then said, "Dad, I've noticed it too. For what it's worth, I think you should talk to your attorney." I had said I was thinking about it. I had done more than think about it. In November of 2022, I had spent 2 sessions with my estate attorney, a woman named Barbara Kincaid, who had been handling my legal affairs since 2004, and who had the quality I valued most in legal counsel, which was that she asked the question you hadn't thought to ask, and then waited for the answer without filling the silence. Barbara had updated the trust documentation that Francis and I had established in 2018. She had confirmed James as the designated successor trustee, where previously Francis had held that role. She had added Claire as co-trustee with full oversight authority. She had reviewed the retirement account beneficiary designations and confirmed they were current. She had done all of this thoroughly and without drama, and had said at the end of the second session, "Edmund, the structure is sound. The question is whether anyone is going to challenge it." I had said, "That's the question I'm trying to answer." She had said, "Tell me if the answer changes." The answer had begun to change in the first week of March, 3 weeks before the fall, when I had come through the back door and heard Nathan's voice in my kitchen saying the question is, how long before it becomes relevant? The hospital was the University of Kentucky Medical Center on Rose Street. I was admitted Tuesday afternoon and placed in a room on the 4th floor for observation. The X-ray showed no fractures. The hip had a bruise that was going to be significant and painful for 2 to 3 weeks. My neurological assessments were normal. I answered questions incorrectly, where I could do so plausibly. Not dramatically, just with the specific fog that a person of 71 with a head injury might reasonably present. The wrong day. A physician's name confused with another physician's name. A medication I said I couldn't remember the name of that I knew perfectly well. The attending physician, a careful young woman named Dr. Reeves, documented a mild cognitive concern, consistent with post-fall disorientation, and ordered 48 hours of continued observation. I lay in the bed and I was cooperative and slightly vague, and I listened. Claire arrived Tuesday evening. She drove from Cincinnati the moment Nathan called her, which tells you something about the difference between the two of them. She arrived at 8:15 with the residue of a 4-hour drive on her face and went directly to the nursing station to ask about my chart before she came to my room, which is what a hospital administrator does, because she understands that the chart is the accurate record and the patient's report of themselves is a different and less reliable thing. She came into my room and she sat beside my bed, and she held my hand, and she did not perform her worry. She was worried, and she held my hand, and that was the expression of it. She said, "Dad, how are you feeling?" I said, with the slightly unfocused quality I had been practicing, "I fell. I remember falling." She said, "I know. The doctors say you're going to be okay. The hip is bruised, but nothing is broken." I said, "Francis was here earlier." Claire's face did something specific in the moment I said that. A grief that was immediate and carefully managed, the face of a child who has learned to hold the loss of a parent in a room where it is suddenly present. She said, softly, "Dad, Mom passed away 3 years ago." I looked at her. I let the moment be what it was. Then I said, "I know. I know she did. I'm sorry." She held my hand tighter. She stayed for 2 hours. She talked to the nurses. She talked to Dr. Reeves. She arranged to take 2 days off from Cincinnati, and she stayed at my house rather than a hotel, because she did not want the house to be empty. She was my daughter, and she was exactly who she had always been, and I want that on the record clearly, because this story requires that you understand the difference between my 2 children, and the difference was visible from the first minute of that hospital stay. Nathan arrived Wednesday morning with Sandra. They came together, which I noted, because Nathan had never previously brought Sandra to a medical appointment or a hospital visit. He had brought her to dinners and holidays and events where social presentation was part of the purpose. He had not previously brought her to a context where legal and financial weight was present in the atmosphere. He was warm when he came into the room. He held my hand. He said he was glad I was okay. He asked Dr. Reeves a number of questions in the hallway, which I could not hear, but which I noted by the duration and the specific body language of a man gathering clinical information rather than seeking reassurance. He sat with me for 40 minutes. We talked about general things. He asked me twice, gently and as if incidentally, whether I had a good sense of what had happened when I fell. I said I wasn't entirely sure. I said it had all happened so fast. He nodded with the expression of someone filing a data point. He and Sandra left the room at 11:15. They said they would be back after lunch. They came back at 2:30. I had been half asleep, or appeared to be, which requires less effort than people expect when you are lying in a hospital bed with a bruised hip on the 4th floor of a medical center. I heard them come in. I kept my eyes mostly closed and my breathing regular, which is not acting so much as simply doing what you do when you are resting. They looked at me. Sandra said he's sleeping. Nathan said they could wait. They went to the window on the far side of the room, which in the logic of hospital room geography felt like a private location and was not one. The window was 12 feet from my bed. Nathan spoke in a low voice. Not a whisper, a low voice, which is the thing you do when you are trying to be quiet and are not fully committed to the effort because you believe the person you are trying to be quiet around is sleeping. He said, Dr. Reeves said the cognitive concern is mild, but they want to watch it. The language she used was consistent with what I was reading about last week. Sandra said, which is what? He said, the kind of thing that qualifies as a managing someone's affairs situation if it progresses. The question is whether the fall accelerated anything. Sandra said, and if it did? Nathan said, then this becomes relevant sooner than we planned. The house goes to both of us when the trust dissolves, but the trust doesn't dissolve until he's either gone or legally determined to be unable to manage his own affairs. If his cognition is actually impaired, that second option becomes something an attorney could move on. Sandra said, does Claire know about the trust structure? He said, she knows the broad strokes. She doesn't know what we've looked into. Sandra said, and the retirement accounts? He said, accessible to the estate trustees at distribution. With Claire and him both listed, it would need to be a conservatorship arrangement. But if the cognitive picture gets clearer in the next few days, it's worth a conversation with Franklin. Franklin, a name I did not yet know, but was about to learn. Sandra said, he's 71, Nathan. This was going to happen. Nathan said, and his voice dropped slightly lower so that I had to hold very still to catch it. I just want to be positioned correctly when it does. That's all I'm saying. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment. I have told parts of this story to my attorney and to Claire and to one other person, and each time I have been asked what I felt when I heard Nathan say, I just want to be positioned correctly when it does. And the answer is the same each time. I felt the load test complete. I felt the measurement register. I felt 38 years of structural engineering distill itself into one moment of absolute clarity about what the data said. The data said my son had been waiting for me to become manageable. The data said he had brought his wife to the hospital not for comfort but for consultation. The data said the word Franklin was the name of an attorney he had already spoken to about my situation, and the data said that the man lying in that hospital bed with a bruised hip and a planned performance of cognitive fog was more prepared for this moment than his son had any idea. I did not move. I breathed. I let them talk for another 3 minutes about logistics I recorded in my memory, with the precision of a man who has spent 40 years creating records that could not be disputed. Then, I let my eyes open slowly. I looked at the ceiling. I said, "Is someone there?" Nathan came to the bed immediately. He said, "It's just us, Dad. Sandra and me. We were just looking out the window." I said, "Oh, I thought I heard Francis." He said, "No, Dad. It's just us." I looked at him. I let my eyes be the eyes of a man who was not quite tracking. And I thought, Nathan, I heard every word. Claire came back that evening. I waited until Nathan and Sandra had gone to the cafeteria. Then I sat up in the hospital bed, with the posture of a man who was entirely himself, and said, "Claire, close the door." She closed it. She came to the chair beside the bed and looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating rapidly. I said, "I need you to know something. I am not cognitively impaired. I have not been impaired at any point since the fall. Everything you have seen from me since Tuesday was deliberate." She stared at me. I told her about the 3 weeks before the fall, about what I had heard from Nathan in my kitchen, about the decision I had made on the laundry room floor. Then I told her what I had heard at the hospital window that afternoon. All of it, the house, the trust, the conservatorship, the retirement accounts. Franklin, I just want to be positioned correctly when it does. When I finished, she was quiet. Her face had gone through several things while I was talking, and arrived at something that was not anger and not grief, but some combination of both, that I recognized, because it was what I had felt on the laundry room floor. She said, "How long have you been watching this?" I said, 3 years of noticing, 3 weeks of being certain, 2 days of confirming it. She said, "What do you need me to do?" I said, "Call Barbara Kincaid in the morning before Nathan does anything. I need my medical record corrected, and I need you to find out who Franklin is." I called Barbara Kincaid from the hospital room the next morning at 8:15, before rounds, before Nathan arrived, before anything else. I told her what I had heard, and what I had done, and what the current status of the medical documentation was. Barbara listened without interrupting, the way she always listened, completely and with the quality of someone who is building the architecture of the legal response while the information is still arriving. When I finished, she said, "Edmund, I need to ask you something directly. Is there any possibility that Nathan has already filed anything?" I said, "It's possible. He mentioned an attorney named Franklin. I do not have a surname." She said, "I'll start searching this morning. A conservatorship petition would be filed in Fayette County District Court. If anything has been filed, I'll know within the hour," I said. "And if it hasn't been filed yet?" She said, "Then we move first. I am going to prepare a declaration of your cognitive competence to be executed today in this hospital. I need Dr. Reeves to provide a current clinical assessment that supersedes the admission documentation. Can you arrange that?" I said, "I need to have a conversation with Dr. Reeves that I should have had on Tuesday." Barbara said, "Have it this morning. Edmund, I also want to tell you something. The documentation we built in November of 2022 is very strong. The trust structure is sound. Claire is co-trustee. Your assets are in order. If Nathan files a conservatorship petition, he is going to be walking into a very specifically prepared room." I said, "That was the intention." She said, "I know. Go talk to your doctor." I asked the nurse to let Dr. Reeves know I wanted to speak with her when she had a moment. Dr. Reeves came at 9:20. I sat up in the bed and I said, without preamble, "Dr. Reeves, I need to be direct with you about something. I have not been cognitively impaired at any point since my fall. The presentation you have been documenting since Tuesday was deliberate. I was testing a situation in my family that I needed to understand. I apologize for the inaccuracy in your records, and I need your help correcting it." Dr. Reeves looked at me for a moment. She was 36 years old and had the quality that good physicians develop early, which is the ability to receive unexpected information without the visible performance of being surprised by it. She said, "Can you tell me what day it is?" I said, "Thursday, March 14th. She said, "Who is the current president?" I answered correctly. She said, "What medications are you currently taking?" I listed them all, correctly, with dosages. She said, "Mr. Graves, I want you to know that nothing I document in this hospital is used for any purpose outside of your clinical care, without your authorization or a legal order. And I want you to know that my professional obligation is to document what I observe, rather than what I am told. What I am observing right now is a fully oriented, cognitively intact 71-year-old male who has a bruised hip. I will update my documentation accordingly." I said, "Thank you." She said, I hope whatever you were testing gave you the information you needed. I said, "It did." She said, "I'll have the updated assessment ready by noon." Barbara called at 10:40. Nothing had been filed in Fayette County District Court. Nathan had not yet moved. We had the morning. Barbara prepared the declaration and brought it to the hospital herself at 1 in the afternoon. She sat in the chair beside my bed, and we went through everything she had drafted. The competency declaration supported by Dr. Reeves's updated clinical assessment, the summary of the trust structure, and Claire's co-trustee status, and one additional document that Barbara had prepared on her own initiative, a formal memo to file, describing the overheard hospital conversation and its relevance to any potential future legal proceeding. I signed everything. Dr. Reeves countersigned the clinical portions. By 2:30 it was in the record and in Barbara's files. Nathan arrived at 3 with Sandra. He came into my room with the warm energy of the previous 2 days, the careful performance of an attentive son, and he asked how I was feeling, and whether I had slept well, and whether I had been able to eat any of the hospital food. I said I had been feeling much clearer since the morning. I said I thought the fog was lifting. He said that was wonderful news. He said he was so relieved to hear it. I looked at him, my son, 44 years old, with his mother's smile and his own particular calculation, standing in my hospital room, 2 days after I had heard him discuss my conservatorship, at the window with his wife. I said, "Nathan, there's something I need to tell you." He said, "Of course, Dad, anything." I said, "I had a very productive conversation with my attorney this morning. Barbara Kincaid. You remember Barbara." Something moved in his expression. "A small thing, barely visible." He said, "Of course. Is everything okay?" I said, "Everything is in excellent order." She reminded me that the trust documentation is very thorough and that Claire is fully established as co-trustee. Barbara said the structure is about as solid as she's seen for an estate of this size. Nathan said, "That's good, Dad. That's really good to hear." I said, "She also reminded me that I should probably let my doctors document any cognitive concerns thoroughly and accurately." She said accurate records are very important in situations like this. Another small movement in his expression. Sandra, standing slightly behind him, was very still. I said, "I think I was a little confused when I came in Tuesday. Dr. Reeves updated her assessment this morning. She said I'm fully oriented." He said, "Dad, that's such a relief." I said, "I thought it would be." We looked at each other, 20 years of Sunday dinners and holiday bourbon, and the patient accumulation of whatever our relationship had been built on, sat between us in that hospital room, and we looked at each other, and I was clear, and he knew I was clear, and he was not certain yet how much I knew. I let that sit. I did not fill the silence. He said, "We should let you get some rest." I said, "I think that's right." He and Sandra left. Claire came out from the family lounge where she had been waiting, walked past them in the corridor without stopping, and came into my room and closed the door. She said, "What was that?" I said, "The beginning of a different conversation." She said, "Did he know that you heard him?" I said, "He knows something changed. He doesn't know what yet." She said, "When are you going to tell him?" I said, "When I'm home, in my house, with Barbara present." She said, "You want Barbara there?" I said, "I want a witness, and I want the conversation documented, because whatever Nathan says in that conversation is part of the record now." Claire sat down. She looked at me for a moment with the expression her mother used to wear when I had done something that was simultaneously correct and more methodical than the situation required. She said, "You know Mom would have figured this out in March." I said, "Francis would have figured it out at the first Sunday dinner when he brought Sandra to the hospital visit." Claire almost smiled. She said, "What do you need between now and going home?" I said, "I need you to find out who Franklin is. The attorney Nathan mentioned. I want to know before we sit down." She found out the next morning. Franklin Greer, estate and probate attorney, office on New Circle Road in Lexington. A man who specialized in contested estate matters, and conservatorship proceedings. A man who had, according to the billing records that Barbara was able to access through a discovery request filed the following week, billed 4 hours to a matter under Nathan Graves's name in February of 2023, 6 weeks before my fall. 6 weeks before my fall. Nathan had not been waiting for the fall to start planning. The fall had simply accelerated a timeline he had already set in motion. I had been right that the 3 weeks before the fall had been a data collection period. What I had underestimated was how long his own data collection had been running. I was discharged on Friday. Claire drove me home. I spent the weekend in the house on Andover Drive, understanding it differently than I had before. I walked through the rooms. I sat in Francis's reading chair. I went to the workshop in the garage and sat at the drafting table and thought about structures. A building fails when the load exceeds the design tolerance. The solution is never to reduce the load. The load is what it is. You over-engineer for the actual load, not the anticipated one, because the actual load is always more complex than the model predicted. I called Barbara Monday morning at 8:15. She searched Fayette County District Court. Nothing had been filed. We had the morning. Nathan came without Franklin Greer. He came alone, which told me that he was not yet certain enough of his position to have his attorney present, and that the fact of Barbara's summons had rattled something in his certainty. He sat across the conference table from Barbara and me, and he looked at me the way he had looked at me in the hospital room when he said, "I was such a relief to hear." The warm, managed expression, the steady presentation. Barbara said, "Nathan, thank you for coming. I want to be straightforward with you about why I asked you here. We have become aware, through the course of Edmund's post-fall medical care and legal review, of several things I want to address directly. First, a conversation that took place in Edmund's hospital room on Wednesday afternoon between yourself and your wife regarding the trust structure, the retirement accounts, and a potential conservatorship arrangement. Second, a billing record from Franklin Greer's office on New Circle Road, showing 4 hours billed to a matter under your name in February of this year, 6 weeks before your father's fall." Nathan said nothing. His hands on the conference table were very still. Barbara said, "I want to give you the opportunity to speak to any of that before I tell you where we are from a legal standpoint." He looked at me, not at Barbara, at me. He said, "Dad." I said, "Nathan." He said, "How much did you hear?" I said, "Everything you said at the window." The specific silence that followed was the silence of a person recounting a conversation in their memory, and understanding, in real time, that the person across the table was recounting the same conversation with the same accuracy. He said, "I wasn't filing anything." Barbara said, "The February billing from Franklin Greer suggests you were at least exploring options." He said, "I was getting information. I was trying to understand what our options were if things got worse." I said, "Nathan, I need you to hear something. The trust is structured in a way that a conservatorship petition would have to overcome Claire's co-trusteeship, my updated medical documentation, a recorded summary of the conversation you had at my window, and 14 months of estate documentation that Barbara has been building since 2022. What I am telling you is that the house you were discussing at my window is not accessible through any legal mechanism you were exploring with Franklin Greer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know you think I'm a bad person." I said, "I think you're my son, and I think you made a calculation about my situation that was based on an assumption I want to correct directly. The assumption was that I was not paying attention. I have been paying attention for 3 years, Nathan. I was paying attention before your mother died. I am paying attention now. I will be paying attention when I am 80 and 90 if I live that long. That is not going to change, and I need you to update your understanding of who you are dealing with." He looked at the table. I said, "I am not going to pretend this conversation didn't happen. I am not going to pretend this conversation didn't happen. What I am going to do is what your mother always said I should do with things I can't control, which is to apply the method. The method says I document, I structure, and I protect what matters. I have done all three. What you do with the information I've just given you is something you need to figure out for yourself." He said, "What does that mean for us?" I said, "It means you're my son, and that is not conditional. It means I expect you to have a direct conversation with me, rather than a window conversation with your wife. And it means if you have concerns about my well-being, or my finances, or my affairs, you bring them to me, not to Franklin Greer." He said, "Okay." I said, "Is that something you can do?" He said, "Yes." Barbara looked at her notes and said nothing, which was the correct professional response to what had just happened in her conference room. The weeks after the meeting were complicated in the way family situations are after something fundamental has been acknowledged without being fully resolved. Nathan called on Sundays again. The calls were shorter and more careful. Underneath them was the texture of two people rebuilding from a point of documented damage. I let it be what it was. Francis always said that forced resolution arrives broken. Claire drove down from Cincinnati 3 weeks after the meeting. We sat on the back porch in the April evening, and she looked at Francis's garden and said, "The roses along the fence need tending before next week." I said, "I've been reading the notebooks." She said, "I'll come back next weekend. I know where she kept the pruning shears." I said, "Third shelf in the potting shed, left side." She said, "Fully cognitively intact." I said, "Fully." She was quiet, then. "Are you okay, Dad?" Not in the engineering way, in the actual way. "I thought about what it cost to hear your son at a hospital window, talking about your house. I thought about holding that through the stay, and the meeting, and the Sunday calls that followed. I thought about Frances. She would have said, 'Edmund, the structure held. Now let yourself feel the load.' I said, 'I'm not sure yet. I need a little more time with it.' Claire said, 'That's allowed.' I said, 'I know.' We sat on the porch until the April dark came in over the yard, and the things Francis had planted along the back fence disappeared into the evening. The potting shed light was on. It made a small square of yellow in the dark. My father used to say that an engineer's real work is invisible, that if you've done it correctly, nobody ever has to think about it. The building stands, the bridge holds, nobody considers the engineering, because the engineering is doing what it was designed to do. I had done the engineering, the structure had stood, and the man who had whispered at my window about how long before it became relevant had discovered that the timeline that mattered was not the one he had been calculating. It was mine, built quietly, completely, and in the specific way that a structural engineer builds things. To last. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Hit that like button, subscribe if you are not already here, and I will see you in the next one. True Story uploads every week. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one. Content. Complete master brief. YouTube family revenge story. Niche. Everything you need to continue this work. Who I am, and what I am building. I am building a YouTube channel in the family betrayal / father revenge story. Niche. This is a faceless narration channel, where AI-generated opasted my father built his empire with a surveyor's level and a stubborn refusal to die poor, and his widow started dismantling it before the flowers on his casket had even wilted. My name is Thomas Livingston. I'm 35 years old. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and for most of my adult life, I believed that fan-pasted